Welcome back. This is the third mini lecture considering ancient Israeli culture for our Ancient Histories unit in Gender 2000. In this one, we're going to look directly at the creation stories in the first couple chapters of Genesis, and the contradictions that they have with each other, what they say, why we think they say these different things. Um, and to do that, we'll look at the number of theorized writers of the Torah, because at least two of them find their way into these early stories. Again, we are looking at these early creation stories to see the ideology of the ancient Israeli people, what they believed, sort of both, religiously and and biologically and historically, and um, how those beliefs about the natural world around them influence the society that they begin to create. We're also looking at this because these very texts at the very beginning of the ancient Israelis' Bible have the order of creation listed, and historically, the order of creation of men and women has been used to justify women's lower status in modern Western civilizations um, as they have evolved. So, um, looking at what the words actually say, the order they actually are in, and understanding a little context behind them will allow us to perhaps challenge that idea. We've already looked at how gender is a construction, how there are multiple genders across multiple different cultures. Um, we've looked in biology about how the idea that there are only two sexes is somewhat oversimplified. And so, from a more feminist perspective, of course, we are looking to see if these texts are really saying what they have been used to say over time in regard to, let's say, gender relationships and different ways of holding power in society. In the last lecture, I talked a little bit about biblical scholars and how they analyze the source material. Um, One of their conclusions, of course, are that there are multiple authors who write and multiple redactors who rearrange texts over the course of the Bible's history. In the Torah, particularly, they identify at least four sources where they're looking at stylistic and material differences to the text. The oldest source that they find in the Torah is the Yahwehist text, or the J text, or the J writer, as they are sometimes referred to. These are stories that have an anthropomorphic presentation of the deity. In other words, they depict God in human ways. So anthropomorphism is basically personification, but using something that's alive. So a personification might be the little engine that could, where you give a train human-like categories. An anthropomorphism is giving something alive human-like characteristics. So, uh, Bambi, for instance, you have deer acting with each other in an environment where they're making, um, it would seem, relationships and choices that would be similar to humans. God, um, is a concept, and among believers, perhaps a living being, and therefore we call it an anthropomorphic presentation rather than personification. So the J writer is writing dramatic narratives. The J writer is telling stories about God and his relationships with people and the universe. And it's a writer that uses Yahweh consistently as the name of God. Yahweh translated into English, Yahweh. And these texts date to the 10th century BCE, so they're among some of the oldest texts in the Bible. They are called the J writer, incidentally, because earlier transliterations of the ancient Aramaic caused people to understand the phonemes a little differently than they came to understand them later. And so that initial translation of the name of God in these texts was seen as Jehovah, but later research caused them to change the pronunciation of that name into Yahweh. And when I say later, I mean after they had already begun the work and already assigned this text to the so-called J writer. So at that point, they already had a Y writer because they went through the alphabet in various different ways. Um, and so they couldn't just say, oh, well, let's call it the Y writer. So the J writer forever in the text since has been those who use Yahweh as the name of God. Um, there are very, very similar texts to these by the E writer who uses Elohim as the name of God. These date to 100 and 200 years more currently than that ancient text by the J writer. So the E writer still is using dramatic narratives, still anthropomorphizing God, sometimes telling the same or similar stories as the J writer, but we will have Elohim as the name of God. What this appears to be is that the ancient Israeli people had these stories, and then they become somewhat separated by, geography, where they're not trading with each other, they're not meeting each other regularly, that perhaps other tribes move in between them, prevent their communication for several hundred years. And as they are recopying those texts over several hundred years to keep them preserved, the name of what they call God shifts. So I liken it to um, the game of telephone, if you've ever had to play that, where the teacher whispers into a student's ear some phrase and they're supposed to pass it on in a whisper from child to child to child to child. And by the time they get to the last child, usually it's not the same sentence that it was in the beginning. Um, so the vagaries of accents, understanding, interpretation, passing a story, a name from one generation to the next. Um, you get variation and change in that. And then at some point, of course, that culture that has the e-texts and the culture that has the J writer authored text comes back together. When they come back together, they recognize all of the texts as sacred. They don't get rid of any. They keep them together. They arrange them in certain different ways, probably changing that arrangement over time. But because they're all sacred, they don't, again, just say, well, yours is right and mine is wrong, and we're going to throw it out. They keep both. They're all the sacred word of God. From their religious perspectives, they all might have insight into different situations at a time or another, so they keep them. The next writer that you find in these first five books of the Bible is the D writer, the Deuteronomic author, and these are found only in the book of Deuteronomy. Traditionally, historians put this at 622 BCE. This is a very religiously affiliated time. 622 BCE is when the Israelis, at one of the greatest moments of their power, are attacked. They are holding Jerusalem and the temple, and they get basically chased out of the town. You have their rivals who come in and they sack the temple. They will regroup outside of the city. They reorganize, they go back in and they take Jerusalem back. When they do, they begin to repair the temple And as the story goes, they find um, that there were religious texts, scrolls hidden under the altar stone um, in the temple, and they recoup those texts and say to the people, look, we found these texts. Our ancestors must have placed them there for us to find today. And we see that when we read these ancient texts that we have fallen away from the relationship that we had with God the way it was supposed to be. And that's probably why we didn't win this battle, but we can recommit ourselves by following these laws, and we'll all be good with God. God will be good with us, and we'll see more success as we go forward. And um, that is the traditional story and what they tell people. Um, this date and these circumstances are under extreme debate within um, scholars, communities that explore these things, both for archaeologic reasons, for language reasons, etc. And it seems to be more of the fact that the rabbis at the time are taking advantage of the feelings of the people and the um, aftermath of violence and being scared to implement changes in the culture that are going to make the culture a little bit more authoritative, make the laws and the punishments a little bit more harsh. And this would be very similar to what we see happening in our own culture after September 11th with the Patriot Act, where we are told by our leaders that we need to agree to have more surveillance over ourselves, um, video wise, audio wise, electronically, etc., so that we can protect ourselves and our country from terrorism. In in some cases within the ancient Hebrew culture that is going to be with them for a while, um, there are different aspects of modern Jewish culture where that where those civil liberties are restored. In Orthodox Judaism, they're still going by some of these older texts in a more literal way. So traditionally, we see the Deuteronomic texts and the laws therein as dating to 622 BCE, but that is contested. The next writer that we see are the priestly writers. This was thought to be a group of rabbis that sometime between 5 and 400 BCE begin to look at the text um, and form that salvation history and try to unify it under that umbrella of we are telling our cultural story. These are the laws. This is how we understand our place in the universe. This is the importance of our God and our culture and our religion, etc. They will include prayers. They will include instructions for ritual. They will include um, uh, poems. They will, um, basically be concerned with kind of, I'm going to say, forming a narrative identity. So they're not focusing on stories about God per se. They're um, explaining to people sometimes uh, what the history means and what the current practices of their day should be. And then, of course, as we mentioned before, there are redactors who are going in there, rearranging the scrolls, the chapters, the verses, the order that they are in over time for different purposes. So some of those rearrangements could be because of worship, some could be to increase credibility, some could be to front the material that they think is more important to them in their time. So when we look at these creation stories in Genesis 1 through 3, what you may or may not notice is that there are two different stories. The first story that we encounter in Genesis 1 will employ a lot of verbal repetition, be precisely and regularly organized, and hangs together as a unit. This is the story that discusses the creation of the world in 6 days. And then God sees what God has done and is happy with it and rests on the seventh day. That resting on the seventh day is used by the Jewish people to indicate that there's one day of the week that they should devote themselves to religious works and not to other endeavors. So, what you will see, first of all, in these two creation stories is that they are etiologies. That's Etiology, an etiology. And that is a story that talks about how something originates and explains how something is the way it is already. Um, and that is very important to our understanding in terms of gender and sexual construction, because what you will have is a patriarchal culture explaining, in essence, how it originated and how it has always been patriarchal. Um, which is to say that it's part of the mythos of the culture. It's not actually factual in a more modern logical sense. So the second story, again, another etiology, uses narratives to tell important lessons to the Israeli people about their relationship with God. It's going to use imagery, it's going to use character, it's going to use um, you know, the plot structure that we are familiar with from studying modern literature. Um, Incidentally, in this culture's creation stories, as well as every other written creation story that we have, um, including those recorded from oral traditions by scholars, we see that that idea of telling a story seems somewhat foundational to human nature, that we understand things in a certain chronology, that we look for things to be entertaining and dramatic and also, to teach us things. So, in that first creation story, we'll notice that the details are somewhat different than in the second, because the order of creation in Genesis 1 to 2, about the fourth verse, is that plants are created, then animals, then man and woman. The order of creation in Genesis 2.5 is different. Man is created, then plants, then animals, and then woman. And it is the order in the second text here that the Greco-Roman culture will use as further proof of the rightness of patriarchy and the rightness um, of having men understood to have and hold more power than women, and the subordination of women to certain tasks that are seen as essential but are not usually financially rewarded within culture. What I would like to point out too is that in Genesis 1, through those first couple lines of Genesis 2, um, you have an example of the priestly writing. So it is a more relatively new piece of text that gets fronted to this more ancient text of the story of creation, um, that in some ways seems to be very unique to the ancient Israeli people. That first text we encounter in Genesis 1:1 and on, which describes creation in 6 days and attributes those to God who speaks and creates the world, is going to have significant parallels to Egyptian creation stories. Specifically, all 6 of those aspects of creation that are handled in those 6 days happen in ancient Egyptian creation stories in the same order, but rather than by being created by one God, as the ancient Israelis believed. Um, it is written that they are created by God and goddess pairs. And so each day of creation that we read that God does is an ancient Egyptian pair of god and goddesses who create that act by speaking. And then they create two children, usually a male and female god and goddess, that then creates whatever the next day's creation topic is in Genesis. So it is pretty clear that the ancient Israelis encounter the Egyptian creation story and append it to their own texts, but they change the god and goddess pairs into their one god. Um, and there are a number of different reasons that they do this. They could be seeing the Egyptians' story as being credible, but putting in that their disagreement religiously exists with that idea of the pantheon of god and goddesses that ancient Egypt had. And they attribute all of the same steps of creation to the Hebrew God instead. Um, there's probably also politics involved in this because ancient Egypt was the superpower of the world. It was recognized as the most learned place where the scholars went to study in the Library of Alexandria. And it's the most successful financially, where you have, ages and ages of Egyptian kings being buried with incredible wealth and, loyal servants or people who will, in theory, become loyal service in the afterlife. It's just incredible power and incredible wealth, and it's probably good to um, idealize them and cast yourself as someone who can agree with some of their philosophies, especially if you want to trade. Later in the Old Testament, later in the Torah, you'll read that the Israelis claim, of course, in this famous story of Moses, to have been enslaved by the Egyptians and make their escape, um, being pursued by the pharaohs. This has been immortalized in an old film starring Charlton Heston called The Ten Commandments that plays during Easter time a lot. Um, what we should know is that the Egyptians kept extensive records and they never report having anyone like the Israelis that they are using as slaves or otherwise in their community. Um, that doesn't mean that the Israelis weren't enslaved by another group of people in their history, but it does suggest that it was probably a different group of people, and that when they are telling the story, they make them Egyptians because it would be better, um, public facing wise to have been enslaved by Egyptians and not some other sort of equal status clan or tribe that they were in conflict with. Um, there will be texts within in their writings too that explain that they also conquer other peoples and hold them as slaves, sometimes for a long time, sometimes temporarily, etc. Again, they were a very warlike group of people throughout history, at least in as far as their and other people's counts can show us. But getting back to the subject at hand, we see the order of creation different in the first creation story from the second creation story. We have hints archaeologically and through stylistic devices, etc., for their different origin points. We are also, of course, as I mentioned, complicated, having the complication of interpreting these through several different levels of translation. And one of the largest is that the ancient Hebrew people did not have pronouns. They used the name of God, and then they would link a bunch of verbs to that noun. Um, so anytime we read the Lord God, He did this in the Bible, particularly in terms of the Old Testament, if you're using a Christian Bible. All of those he's with the capital H in the religious translations are reflecting our understanding or more modern understanding of that God as a male identified patriarchal sort of God. In the original Hebrew, we get the name of God, we get lists of their verbs, we get an idea of God creating humanity, um, and particularly in that first creation story, a line where it says God creates people in his own image. Again, taking out the his from that because it just means in God's own image, that men and women, God created them. So taking out that pronoun, of course, you see that men and women are created simultaneously in the image of God. In the original Egyptian, that image of God is a male and female goddess god pair creating humanity. Um, and so it makes a little bit more sense in that context. In traditional, more Christian interpretations of that ancient Hebrew text, you have that, or Israeli interpretations, you have that one God creating people in its image. And there are further texts that don't get incorporated or canonized into their most sacred text, the Bible, that will explain sometimes that God originally had two faces, a male face and a female face, and that's how men and women can be created in their image, in essence. Um, and that's probably enough on that there. So the ultimate meaning, of course, for our purposes is in that priestly authored text. Men and women are created at the same time. And because they're created at the same time, there's no justification that one is um, more superior and one is more subordinate than the other. By Genesis 2:7, we get into the J. Writer's text, where we see, man and woman being treated, it seems, a little bit differently from the moment of creation. Phyllis Tribble in her writings will explain that the word man in that text comes from the Hebrew word Adama, um, you know, also indicating that in modern English translations, we use Adam as the name of that creature. And Adam, of course, tends to be a male identified name within our culture. However, um, in the ancient Hebrew, Adama just meant coming from the earth, a creature of the earth. And this becomes more significant when we look at the verbs associated with this creation. And in this creation, God is taking clay from the earth, blowing his breath into it, and creating Adam. Um, the verbs associated with this are those associated with the idea of making pottery, as it's used in other places by the ancient Israelis. So you get the idea that Adam comes from the earth, and it is God that shapes him and blows like sort of a divine breath into him and animates him as an earth creature. Um, Still, there's nothing in the text to indicate any, gender or sex identity in the original understanding of all those words. Um, by Genesis 2:23, we will begin to see that breakdown. I wanted to focus a little bit, though, on the importance of the metaphor of a potter making us out of clay. Because in that ancient world, in the desert, pottery is the thing that allows you to transport water. Um, Pottery is the difference between life and death in a harsh climate. The invention of pottery, um, is going to allow humanity to get a stronger foothold in the environment and to make gains in terms of territory, in terms of culture, and certainly in terms of dominion over other creatures that God, makes at some other time, maybe from the same ways, maybe from different ways. So by Genesis 2:23, we begin to see that division and that there are two early creatures, and we infer one is a man and one is a woman. In modern English translations, we'll know that women is the second. The word used in the initial text is a word that still means an earth creation. It still doesn't have, within the ancient Aramaic meaning, any sex or gender difference. The first time we will get that, um, we will learn that the woman in Hebrew is Isha and the man is Ish. And that first differentiation among them still has no implication of an unequal status. Um, that, of course, gets appended to it, etiologically speaking, um, as the result of Adam and Eve's participation in the Garden of Eden and their interaction with the serpent, and um, and potentially as part of the punishment for disobeying God's rules for them. So Phyllis Tribble in her article will tell us that this is a pun, that Isha and Ish are sort of onomatopoeic words that are really resembling a breath in and a breath out. Isha and Ish, sort of an inhalation and an exhalation. So they're two sides to life, the two things necessary for life, breathing in and breathing out. And it's going to sort of mimic that creation where God gives us respiration by breathing into this clay vessel. Tribble is also going to point out that the order of creation is very traditional in ancient Hebrew and is understood to be part of a cyclical construction where you give the most important points of a story first and last. This is a very large contrast to the Roman way. And if you've ever had to outline a paper that you're writing, you'll note you start with the most important points as number one, number two, and number three. And then the details under one, two, or three get filled in with with letters or Roman numerals or, some other labeling system. So a comparison is that sometimes, you don't have a complete idea or meaning with the haiku until you get to the third line. Similarly, in a cyclical construction, the whole idea is not granted until that most important last point is revealed. So Tribble will say what the ancient Israeli people are saying is that the creation of humanity is important and that man and women's creation is intertwined and sort of inseparable. When the Romans begin to read the text and translate it, they are going to order it as if the most important point is first and the least important point is last. And that will reaffirm their already patriarchal ideas about the nature of reality. And that will have significant consequences because Rome, of course, will eventually become Christian, and the Holy Roman Empire will attempt to rule all of Europe and into Asia. And many of the laws that we still have today can be traced back to there. Many of the ideologies we have today can still be traced back there. Some of the more unique aspects of this second creation story in the Bible is Eve's creation from the rib. There is no Mediterranean or Middle Eastern parallel to this. This also will be used by politicians, by religious leaders, etc., to establish male supremacy, and in some cases, maybe disguise Eve's divinity, if you believe that they're created sort of equally together at the beginning. Um, so, um, putting Eve lower on the pedestal. Um, it reminds me kind of the uh, Supreme Court conclusion um, that found that segregation um, always creates inequality, that separate can't be equal, in other words. Um, Scholars wonder if the idea of Eve being created from Adam's rib comes from academic error. The nomadic Israeli people certainly traveled and saw sculptures and relief art in other cultures' areas while they were trading or maybe while they were enslaved. And there is a very famous relief structure where the goddess Aneth is posed sort of flying over her lover, Mot, while he murders his twin. Mot was driving a curved dagger under the fifth rib rather than removing one and creating something else. But scholars wonder if that that sort of knife was taken as an example of an extraction of a rib, and then, the creation of Eve, etc. Um, there's some evidence, but not a lot, that that could be the case. Um, we also know, of course, from the text that the word Sela is the Hebrew word um, for rib. So Eve, though designed to be a helpmeet, proved to be in some ways inseparable from Adam. So a rib, as in on the positive interpretation, part of the structure, um, and also inseparable. But it also has a secondary meaning as a stumbling or a misfortune in ancient Hebrew. And so it could be sort of a patriarchal, misogynistic joke that gets included in the text. And some of the Apocrypha, these are ancient Israeli writings that don't get canonized and not included in in the sacred text eventually. We will learn that Eve's formation comes from God taking Adam's tail. Um, this falls out of favor, of course, because it makes Adam and Eve both seem like lesser animals, and not the sort of elevated in God's own image distinction between some of the other primates that might have tails. So um, it could also certainly suggest that the ancient peoples had encountered sort of an unclosed spinal cord that goes down to the tailbone that doesn't get enclosed within the skin. And so there could be, some element of trying to explain things that they didn't completely understand, that comes out in those ancient writings. Again, that apocryphal version is called Apocrypha because it is not included in the most canonized religious texts. All of this brings me to the point that the words that we read form how we think about what it is that we are reading. So the metaphor of God creating humanity uses uh, metaphors of pottery creation, which of course could be created by men or women. Men or women were potters in the ancient world. It also sometimes uses the words labor in translation. And Tribble will point out that that laboring is linked to words that they use that are related to childbirth. So God, as a one entity that gets thought of sometimes as patriarchal, goes through labor pains to create humanity in the way that we would describe a human woman doing that. which provides a little bit more evidence that either that God had two sexes immediately associated with it. Um, even ideologically speaking, in ancient Israel, just sort of like that idea in ancient Egypt. Um, the other thing is, of course, that we can use that metaphor of God the Father as one that would be reaffirming a male identity and male only identity to that ancient deity that the ancient Israelis worshipped. Um, God as a father in metaphorical form is only used 10 times across 37 books in the Old Testament. By the time Christianity develops, we will see that uh, patriarchal understanding that comes with it gets much intensified. In the New Testament, in the epistles, we have, or excuse me, in the Gospels, we have Mark at about 70 years after the death of Christ, using God the Father as a metaphor one time. By the time of John, 30 to 40 years later, he uses it 73 times in a shorter book. So obviously, if you read the same metaphor 73 times, it might sort of penetrate your brain and become accepted, especially if you're not questioning it um, much more easily. And it's going to inform your worldview and it's going to inform how you see God. Um, and so we can see that a knowledge of language, knowledge of the history of the translations, can allow us to see that there's wiggle room in that, supposed idea that God creates man superior to woman from the beginning. Um, and indeed, perhaps would allow us to even question that the nature of God is entirely masculine all the time. And I have only a little bit left to go here, um, but I think I will um, just jump into it and hopefully spare you an extra click. I mentioned the apocryphal material in terms of Eve before. You should see that in your readings. You have Lewis Ginsburg's Legends of the Jews. He wrote this after translating a number, just a huge number of ancient Judaic texts into German, and it was then translated by, I think her name was Henrietta Zold, into English. But one of the counter creation stories where God creates Adam and then God needs to create Eve, has him creating Eve the same, well, creating woman, let me say, in the same way as he created man. He picks um, clay up, he blows life into it, and he creates a partner for Adam. In this apocryphal tale, this first female creation is called Lilith. She will have vestiges of existence across Middle Eastern stories. Um, the idea that her name in English translation is Lilith is thought to be linked to references to both a demon in the Talmud, to other ancient Assyrian and otherwise creatures, ancient Sumerias, Lalake, I believe. Um, Sometimes she'll be equated with being a primordial spirit Leviathan. Um, in Spain in the 13th century, they build on this and will describe her as having the form of a beautiful woman from her head to her waist, but burning fire from the waist down. And she is generally used um, post, uh, let's say, post creation of texts that that honor Eve as an alternative to Eve and sort of the bad example of what can go wrong during creation, as opposed to the more positive outcome that humanity has with Eve. So she is the first wife of Adam. She objects to um, Adam sort of lording it over her. She um, tells Adam she's created the same way he is and she doesn't have to listen to him. And Adam will, in the text that you read, then go to God and say, hey, she's not listening to me. And God will say, Lilith, you better listen to Adam or I'm going to punish you and you'll be expelled and you're going to have to, have demon children and maybe eat them or whatever. And Lilith is basically like, you know what, that sounds better than staying with Adam, and she leaves. So you can see that if you are trying to promote God as an omnipotent, all-powerful being, that you don't want to think that he can be disobeyed that easily by one of his own creations. Probably, scholars believe, Lilith exists as a foil to cultures that have more equal relations with men and women. So Canaanites or Egyptians, where women had the ability to own property, where they had the ability to choose their own sexual partners, where they had the equal ability to practice their religion, worship in temple, etc., in ways that they did not have in some of the more patriarchal ancient cultures like ancient Assyria and certainly ancient Israel. Um, so she could also come from the Babylonian Assyrian word Lulutu, another female demon in Babylonian history. She could be Lalake, again from the Temple of Gilgamesh, where she's a demoness who dwells in the trunk of a willow, which gets tended by the goddess Inanna on the banks of the Euphrates. It could even be that she is a demon night monster from Saudi Arabian folklore. But what we note about her is that she is disobedient. Um, like Eve, who thinks she can make her own decisions, Lilith makes her own decisions. As Western culture solidifies and sort of looks back to these religions, Lilith becomes the negative example um, to Eve. She will be sort of linked to sexual provocation and to women who might draw male attention away from the good women who are their wives and mothers and ostensibly chaste daughters. Um, so she is sort of the first member of the First Wives Club, and that idea of a good woman and a bad woman sort of finds its foil with Lilith and Eve, in these early modern legends. Um, Eve, I should point out, again, sort of similarly to Pandora in Greek religion, is seen as this mixed bag. It's something you can't live without, but also something that maybe um, is not always working out great for you. Pandora will open the box that, releases disease and misfortunes. But also, she maintains hope, etc. Eve disobeys what seems to be, um, a directive from God, and that begins the cycle of punishment. But you'll know Tribble um, will attribute the levels of punishment as, not necessarily being fair for a number of different reasons. And we want to remember too that these are etiologies, so they're explaining the existence of things that already exist in the world and how they came about. So when Eve gets punished by having painful childbirth, this is like the ancient Israelis reaching for some kind of explanation for why this would be, other than, the biology that exists in humans just is not fair in this way. They try to justify that in that way. So these three mini lectures should tell you a lot about ancient Israeli culture. They aren't the only ancient cultures we will look at, um, and hopefully you will gain from all this knowledge and be able to think about the world, or at least our origins in a little bit different way.